So Magnus Carlsen cannot stop sacking his queen right now. We saw an epic queen sack in the quarterfinals of the Chess.com Speed Chess Championship. That one was played against Fabiano Caruana. I covered that one the other day. I'll link the video at the end. And today he was playing against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave in the semi-finals. And this is game 2 of the match. Magnus had black and he sacks his queen. Really just a fantastic game. Now I'll reveal the final match score at the end of this video, but first off let's take a look at this one. So they had 5 minutes on the clock each plus a second increment. So here we had e4 from Maxime, g6 from Carlsen, so he goes for the modern defense. So he's letting white take the center with d4. Now he goes pawn to d6. Knight c3 develops, bishop g7, bishop e3 from MVL, and now a6 from Magnus. So I'm highlighting these moves here. In the first 4 moves, black's pushed 3 pawns and he's only pushed them 1 space. So breaking opening principles, but this is one of those hyper modern openings they're called. You give white the center, but you look to undermine it, strike at it later in the game, hope that white overextends. Now we had h4 from Maxime, so a very modern way to approach the position, push that rook's pawn, try and open it up, but here Magnus goes h5, he shuts that one down. Bishop d3 develops, now knight to f6, and this is a good example of where you don't want to overextend as white. So if you go e5 here, black can capture, pawn recaptures, and this knight actually has a couple of good squares it can hop to, plus this pawn could become weak. So it's not how you want to treat the position. Leave the pawns where they are, keep black cramped. Knight f3 is a good way to do this, just developing a piece. And now Magnus doesn't play in a kind of bog standard way with castles here. He goes knight to g4, already putting a question to MVL. He's hitting this bishop. You don't want to lose the bishop pair so early. So it comes to g5, and now Magnus goes knight to c6. More pressure on the center. More trying to entice white into already advancing the pawns, giving up a big square. Black would be doing okay here, so not what you want. So knight e2 from MVL, great move, best move in the position. And now again Magnus doesn't play standard, he goes knight to b4, moving yet another piece, breaking more opening principles. Really not for the faint-hearted, this opening. Now he's hitting the bishop, so it saves itself. And now Magnus goes d5. Excellent timing, because once you push and you're attacking both of these, you're forcing white to crumble the center. So the pawn was captured, the knight took back, and now the bishop dropped back here, clearing the way for pawn c4 at the right moment. c6 now from Magnus. So if white plays c4 immediately, you've cleared a square on c7. The knight could then maneuver into e6 or support bishop e6. That's the whole idea. So here we just had queen d2, leaving c4 up his sleeve, and now Magnus goes a5. So he's now looking to trap that bishop, you know, with a4, b5, force it to give up for the knight, not what you want. So now c4 is played, drives this knight back. Now coming to c7 was actually the most accurate move when you're running this with the engines, but Magnus comes back here, and now knight c3, that one redeploys into the game. It did its job defending this pawn, and now bishop f5 develops to a nice diagonal, and MVL immediately challenges that strong piece. So Magnus chops off, queen recaptures, now he finally castles his king. MVL does the same, and again this is a moment to pause and take stock. So white is better, has the center, but black's doing okay. So the top engine moves here are queen to c7, just developing, connecting those rooks, stopping any kind of bishop f4 stuff. Or there's this knight h6 move, which the engine's like. Really nice idea actually. Redeploying that knight to f5 and potentially clearing now g4 for this knight so that they're not trying to occupy the same squares. But Magnus does neither of those. He goes knight to h7. Now what's his idea? Well, he's going after this bishop, which you don't want to give up as white ideally. But if you come to e3 to then hold on to this pawn, which is now attacked twice, well then black can be taking, pawn recaptures, the knight can hop back, coming to g4, whoops, and this is just a good position for black. This isn't what you want as white with this shattered pawn structure. So that's why the bishop came to f4 here, but now with the pawn undefended, you can take it, and it's what Magnus did. But this is a really brave move because you're walking straight into a pin. Now MVL brings this rook and not this one because there's problems on f2. How do you defend this now? It's attacked twice. Well, you have to push a pawn, one of these two. Now, if you go c5, which Magnus didn't play, this is playable, but after white captures, well, then they're going to win the pawn back. Now, they want bishop e5 to pick it up. First, you kick the knight. This is the best way to play. Now, there is some craziness starting with e5 here, but if black goes knight to f6, another one of the top moves, well, then you can go bishop e5, you pick up the pawn soon, and white's for choice. You're first to that open file, you're going to double soon, better pawn structure. Okay, game goes on. So Magnus didn't want to be sort of slightly worse like that. He chose to be slightly worse like this, because he is slightly worse, by the way. So he pushes e5, allows that pawn to be taken, chops back with his knight, knight recaptures, and now the queen sack is not forced. He does have some different moves here, for example, pawn to c5, but it's an ugly position. You know, look at these squares for the knights and that kind of thing. But what Magnus does here is take with the bishop. I mean, the writing's on the wall, right, when you see the name of this video. And as I said at the start, so the queen is sacked. The rook recaptures. Now, what has Magnus got for this queen? Well, he's got a rook and a bishop. But it's white with the initiative here. So queen b3 was played, hitting this pawn. Now rook d7 defending and knight e4 coming into here. So white does stand a bit better, roughly a pawn or so ahead when you run it with the engines. But there are some tactical shots that are going to be coming up against this white king, the f2 pawn, because now here comes the knight trying to recycle back into the game. So MVL doesn't chop. He goes knight c5. Great move. Probing against the rook and the pawn. It comes across to e7. And now rook d1 hits this open file. By the way, just to say here, if you capture this pawn, you're running into this pin, you're losing a piece. So you can't do that. So that's why rook d1 comes to this open file. Now rook f to e8 doubles. And here there's actually some tactical shots already being set up. So because the bishop is stopping the king's escape square, you've got these doubled rooks threatening to check and mate if this bishop ever moves. Well, that's why g3, just trying to stop some of those threats. But now here comes knight g4, and obviously it's much harder to now play f3 or something like that. There could be bishop d4 stuff later. So this is dangerous. And now Maxime, he decides to kind of bail out here into a position where he thinks he can keep control. So knight e4 is technically best, but he goes for knight b7 here, takes that pawn. Now, as I mentioned, you're walking into a pin, and this is what Magnus plays. But now because this rook came to the d file, that rook wasn't on d1 in the earlier variation I showed, well, you can check like this, forces these rooks off, knight recaptures, and not only have you won a pawn, but you're about to win a second pawn. However, black gets bishop to d4. And you can see there's this massive counterattack now coming against the white king. So MVL captures the pawn. Magnus takes here with check. King g2. And now here comes the rook invading into the position. Also, it could have gone to e2 there. That was slightly the preferred move of the engines. But now queen b8 check. The king slides up. And now MVL, he picks up a third pawn here. So he'll be completely winning if he can get those pawns running. But there's rook e2 now, which Magnus plays. If he goes rook g1 check, by the way, well, the king can actually run like this. Because you can't carry on checking here. The queen can give itself up. And obviously this is a completely one endgame with all of these pawns running. So that one's no good. Instead, the rook comes to e2. And it sets up this simple threat of moving the bishop away with check, picking up the white queen. Now, the king runs in the game. But if the queen comes to, say, b5, coming onto a light square, also defending this knight, preparing to push this pawn, well, then you can play a move like bishop to e3 check. And you just start creating these mating threats around the king, basically. So if it comes up to f3, which is the best move, then you can check, drive the king further up the board, And rook d2 is a really kind of silent killer move. It just takes away this square. The knight's already taking this one, the bishop's taking this one, and you're setting up f5 check followed by rook f2 mate. So then queen b7 could come, whoops, queen b7, pinning the pawn. The line goes on and on and on. The king keeps getting hunted. Long story short, Maxim's instincts were correct that that king is about to get hunted if you're not careful. So he already runs with king to f3 here, but now Carlsen can check like this, forces it back into the box, rook e2. And by the way, if you try king to h3 here, well, the problem is you move the bishop away and you're actually going to shut this trap with knight and rook, checkmate the king. You just can't stop that checkmate. So the king comes back to f3, Carlsen checks, and this was actually a repetition, drew the game. So no bloodshed, I'm afraid, but I wanted to show you this one because I just loved that game. I love Carlsen's approach to his chess at the moment. Now, what was the actual score in the match? So this was the final score. Carlsen won 17 points to 9. He advances to the final to face Hikaru. It was a more tense match than it might look on paper. There were moments when it looked like MVL might be coming back, but Magnus was always just that step ahead, really. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this one. Excuse me, can't clear my throat. If you want to see the game between Magnus and Fabi played in the quarters, then check out the video on screen. Do hit subscribe to never miss a future video, and I hope to see you again soon. Thanks for watching.